Welcome to the Iconoclast Roundtable. I'm your host, Sarah Haboubi, and we all know that since March 2020 we've been facing ever-increasing levels of censorship, and of course that has stifled the ability to have open and free debate and conversations that will allow people to get a fair and comprehensive view of what's been going on. And obviously without debate, democracy doesn't exist. But there has been an increasing growing demand for alternative voices. So the Iconoclast Roundtable, created by Ryla Media in association with the Irish Inquiry, the aim of this is actually to provide information so that people can start to make their own minds up based on information from many different points of view. So around this table we have an incredible group of people, a group Carl Jung would have called the Redeemer personalities. People who've somehow managed to emancipate yourselves from the mass psychosis, the collective psychosis that's gone on. You've managed to stay true to yourselves, and you've actually also done this despite criticism, ridicule, and even, for some of you, legal action taken against you. So here we have GP Dr. Gerard Waters. I'm going to read his description because it's so long. There's no way I'd be able to remember this. So Gerry, you're a bus driver's son from Drimnagh. You put yourselves through medical college and a PhD in Maynooth University. And you've been in the medical arena for over 50 years. Dr. Waters was also a medical advisor on several RTE shows, including Open Hours, 12 to 1 and Live at 3. He's run a very successful practice in Selbridge until he was forced to close last year because of what was considered controversial views about the pandemic and the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. We have Graham Neary, previously a fund manager working in London. Graham now runs his own private investment company, and he writes regular newsletters about investments and has interest in macroeconomics. Welcome back, Tracey O'Mahony, lawyer, founder of the Irish Council for Human Rights. Tracey, you're very famous for your no-nonsense videos that have helped people to understand the legal aspects of what's actually been going on since emergency powers were taken by the government. And in April this year, Tracey initiated a people's challenge against the unlawfulness of the COVID-19 laws. We have another GP, Dr. Marcus de Brun from Rush, and you have, again, a very wide and broad experience. But Marcus famously resigned from the Irish Medical Council over the treatment of the elderly in nursing homes at the height of the pandemic. And welcome back, Ivor Cummins. And frankly, if you haven't heard of Ivor, I'm not sure what rock you've been living under. Ivor is a biochemical engineer, complex problem solver, and host of the Fat Emperor podcast series that explores how we can take care of our own health through diet, etc. So to kick off, in March 2020, and from then on, it was expressly stated by very well-known private individuals, politicians, chief medical officers around the world, and organisations such as the WHO, that everyone had to do their bit, that there would be no return to normal without a vaccine. Yet here we are, more than a year and a half later, a COVID-19 injection has been rolled out under emergency use authorisation only. Those who are considered vulnerable have pretty much all received their jab. The curve, I think, has been well and truly flattened at this stage, but no sign of our freedoms returning just yet. So, Gerry, what's your experience been over the last year and a half?
Well, very, very soon after the news broke from Wuhan that the people were collapsing in the streets, I remember seeing pictures of people collapsing in the streets from this dreaded virus. And then it rapidly spread. In March, we were hearing stories of it spreading to Italy, where already the authorities were locking down the people. I decided to do my own private research, to find out what was happening. And I looked up the death rate in Italy. What was the death rate? The death rate was 10.6 per thousand. It was particularly high because they have an elderly population. And then I multiplied that across by the population, which was 60.4 million. And I came up with figures like something like 660,000 people die in Italy every year. And then I divided that by a month and by 12 months and found that there were 58,000 people dying in Italy every year. 58,000. And this is in the back, the hysteria was going on a background of 58,000 people dying every month, when they had 2,800 people dead, I remember looking at the figures, in the first month, dead. And you thought, well, but that's a fair few, if they're in addition to the people that die normally. But then I looked up the figures and found that the average age of the people dying was 81.6. So I thought, well, if the average age of people dying in Italy at that stage is 81.6, and the life expectancy is 82, or even maybe less than that, but it's around that, I thought, well, these are surely the people who are dying under normal circumstances. This is not additional, you know. Then I looked up and I found that no children were dying of it. That's an impossibility. It's an absolute impossibility. And since then, in the 14 months, 16 months, since then, I have asked many paediatricians, I've many experts as to why children are not dying of the COVID-19, you know, are not even being sick with it. They cannot give me an explanation. The ICGP every Wednesday, or every second Wednesday, held a expert panel on COVID-19. And these people sat around and told us that all about the vaccine and how to put on a mask and how to put on a gown and how to double glove and all sorts of things. And but what they never answered was why children are not dying. And they say, oh, they have a different immunity. Of course they have a different immunity. They have a compromised immunity. Any of us who've reared children know that your children have snotty noses and coughs and earaches for the first 5 or 6 years, or 7 or 8 years of their lives. That is primarily viral infections they're getting. They're getting in viral and a few bacterial infections, but they're getting these viral infections and they're forming their immunity. And they're the questions that I had. I put these questions to the ICGP. I put them to a friend of mine in the Department of Health. I put in a personal advisor to Leo Varadkar. So back in March or April last year, I was screaming at them saying, hey, what's going on? Why are children not sickening from this? Why are children not dying? Why is the average age of people dying with it 81.6? Why are there no postmortems being done? And they said, you know, everybody thinks, oh, you know, what's postmortems? Postmortems are the scientific method. If you have a question in science and you ask, well, how do you solve it? People are dying, what are they dying because of? Well, then you do a postmortem. And there are characteristic changes in the postmortem, at a postmortem, whereby you see clotting within the small alveoli, the arterioles and of the alveoli of the lungs. And that's characteristic for a SARS-CoV-2 death. They wouldn't do postmortems. They were wrapping the people up in plastic bags and burying them immediately. I screamed at the Department of Health. I screamed at the ICGP. I pleaded with them to A, explain to me why children were not dying, and B, why the average age is 81.6, and C, why the postmortems were not being done. That would be the simple thing. People came up with silly excuses then, like, oh, but it's too dangerous. I would have opened the people without a mask. I was so confident that COVID-19 would not kill me. And I'm 71. And I have high blood pressure. So that I had no fear of COVID-19 from the very, very beginning, you know.
Thanks, Jerry. So, Graham, you've been looking very closely at the stats across. What's your take on what's happened over the last year and a half from that point of view?
Well, my background is in finance, specifically researching companies. And one of the things I got reasonably good at over the years was figuring out how company managements deceive shareholders in order to raise money. And actually, what the governments have done is much simpler and much more straightforward than what you find in the stock market. It didn't take me that many months to figure out that there were shenanigans. And one of the things I've called it online is I've called it the greatest relabeling exercise in the history of the world. And I've done that mostly through looking at death statistics, but also looking at ICU count. So you can find the total ICU usage in the HSE. And And when you study these, you find that the official numbers cannot possibly be true. So it's a statistical trick, effectively, that is the basis of the numbers that they feed us. And from a sort of political point of view, it's just a tragedy that people have been force-fed these numbers as headline news for a year and a half when they make no sense, they can't be true. And you know, if you look at the ICU, for example, about 300 ICU patients last year from April to December, and that stays the same whether there's 150 COVID patients or whether there's 10 COVID patients. So either they don't need the surge capacity, or they didn't need the surge capacity, or they refuse to use it for some strange reason. And it's the same in terms of deaths. If you look at the 65 plus death rate in Ireland as published by the CSO last year, you find that it is significantly better than 2018. And the difference between 2019 and 2020 is about 150 deaths in the over 65 age category. Those are the government numbers, and I'm happy to publish them, but I've already published them and shown them. So there's, you know, the most that could be argued is that there was a seasonal fluctuation in April that was caused by COVID. But one thing the Irish government has refused to do is to estimate how many people were killed by the lockdown itself, the emptying of the hospitals. In the UK, at least, the ONS was good enough to put an estimate. I don't know how good the estimate is, but the Irish government has not acknowledged that anybody was killed by lockdown, and I think that's a crime.
Tracey, you know, hearing this, and obviously you've heard these stats as well, what's your view on, from the legal aspect, how the government has actually got away with this?
Fear. Everything has been driven by fear over the last 18 months, fear and propaganda, and the media have bought into it. So, like, I would always have assumed that governments are always there to gain more control. So in one way, even though I do absolutely hold them responsible, that's kind of the role of government, is to get control, gain control, and not give up that control. And I think probably up until maybe March 2020, we had some resemblance of a media that held the government to account. And that's what's really been lacking over the last 18 months, is there is no accountability through the media. There is no debate on, you know, both sides of the table. They're not allowed to be debated. And that's normally how we hold the government to account, is they know that, you know, the information is eventually going to come out, the public are eventually going to question, but that hasn't been allowed to happen over the last 18 months. And that might be partly to do with the level of funding that these media organisations are getting around COVID, which has really acted as a barrier to, you know, for any of those organisations to actually speak out or let anybody onto their shows to actually debate the information. So in terms of, you know, I think why things have escalated and continued in the way that they have is around fear and propaganda. But just in terms of, I suppose, you know, March 2020, while I suppose other people, you know, doctors or scientists or statisticians, like, I wouldn't have known any of that, I suppose, in March 2020, any of the information that we know now. And I probably wouldn't talk on those topics anyways, because I don't think I'm qualified to do it. But I know when I saw the laws in March 2020, what it said to me was, we have never allowed these type of laws in a civilised democracy before, in a free country where free citizens are meant to be able to decide the risks and benefits for themselves. So when I saw those laws coming out in March 2020, it terrified me to the bone. Not just in terms of what those laws would do right now, as in March 2020, but what they would do in terms of creating precedents into the future. And also what it would do in terms of creating a mindset in people that freedom isn't valuable, that you're not responsible for yourself, that the government know what's better for you in terms of safety than you do for yourself and your family. That terrified me, and I think we've seen that continuously over the past 18 months, that people have been very, very happy to relinquish that responsibility to a government. Whereas if we even look back at, you know, media reports or social media or anything like that, say in January 2020, it was all about kind of a level of distrust around the government. And that's one of the reasons there was such a high level of support for Sinn Féin, I think, you know, in the February 2020 elections, was because people wanted a change. And then as soon as we got into March 2020 and April 2020, the government couldn't do any wrong. So I think between, you know, the levels of fear and propaganda and people being willing to give up their freedom and their own self-responsibility, I think that has escalated what has happened, and I think that's what the government have used to control people over the last 18 months. So it's whether or not people are willing to take back, you know, responsibility for themselves and their families and make their own decisions, that'll determine where we go into the future.
Thanks, Tracey. So, Marcus, you had a bit of a rough ride at the beginning.
Yeah, I've had a rough ride, probably not as rough as what Jerry has had. I haven't been struck off or suspended as of yet, although there have been numerous attempts and inquiries to do so because of my opinion. And it's very difficult even when you use the word opinion, because it kind of gives people the impression, oh, you've got some ideas that kind of go against what the facts are. But I mean, I don't have an opinion on COVID. Prior to COVID, I didn't give a monkeys about COVID. It's not an opinion that I have, and it's not opinions that are being silenced. And this is the thing that I can't understand. It's facts that are being silenced. And this is there's a crucial distinction between opinion and fact, do you know? But we reached a point, I mean, I resigned from the Irish Medical Council. I was appointed by Minister Harris 3 years ago, and I resigned from the Medical Council and hence was kind of thrust into a bit of unwanted spotlight at the time. And the reason I resigned from the Irish Medical Council was a failed attempt, I admit, to whistleblow what was going on in the nursing home sector in Ireland. But, you know, if we cast our minds back and we remember when all of this started, it was keep ourselves safe in order to, specifically, to do one thing, and that was to protect them. Now, if we go back before the fear took over and ask ourselves, who were the them? Who were we talking about? Who were the them back in 2019 and 2020? The them haven't changed. The them are the elderly, the infirm, and the ill. The people with underlying definable comorbidities are people who can get very sick and occasionally can die from COVID. Now, even making statements like that, if we go back to this notion that, oh, that's just your opinion, Dr. de Brun, there are people, young people are dying from COVID. Well, where as a physician, as a scientist, and as a researcher, or even just looking for facts, where I go to is I don't go to Twitter, and I don't go to YouTube. I go to places like the CSO, I go to places like the Department of Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University. You know, I go to reliable sources of fact. And so it's hard not to be a little bit resentful when people say that what you have to offer is an opinion. As I said, I don't have an opinion, and I don't think too many people at the table here have an opinion. We're coming from a place of fact. We're coming from a place of reality. We're coming from a place of common sense. But somewhere during all of this crisis, facts stopped mattering. Counterfactuals, arguing points, returning information, as Jerry said, looking at the death rate in Italy, looking at the age profile, looking at the death rate in Sweden, looking at the fact that they've got 3 times the elderly population that we have in Ireland. You know, looking at the facts and looking at the numbers, that stopped working. And the reason it stopped working is for exactly the reason that Tracey pointed out, and that's fear. If a doctor comes out tomorrow and says, oh, I think we can get COVID from door handles and we need to shut this down or shut that down, he'll be given immediate access to the airways and immediate credibility. If another doctor of equal qualification or whatever comes out and says, listen, young people are not at risk or anything, or goes against the fear narrative, he's immediately entirely shut down, you know. And in respect of COVID policy and NEFIT, they've got to keep peddling this fear. They've got to keep peddling this narrative to push it as far as they can until we get 100% of the people vaccinated, and then it'll be a new story. But if we stop for a moment and look back and ask were mistakes made, I mean, disastrous mistakes were made in the nursing homes. You know, we had nearly 1,000 people in Ireland die, and those people have been, you know, willfully forgotten, you know, erased from the national consciousness, and that's bizarre. But 1,000 people die in the nursing homes, and most of that due to political, governmental policy and neglect, NEFIT policy. You know, the reason I resigned from the nursing homes was in the midst of the crisis. Tests were pulled. We couldn't test people for 3 weeks. People from hospitals with broken arms or broken limbs were dumped into the nursing home sector without being tested. All we were given or instructed to give patients was end-of-life care, midazolam, sedate them and let them die. Encouraged in paper, in black and white, encouraged doctors were to get family members in to sign do not resuscitate orders. You know, all of this was disgusting. It was an inhumane way to treat fellow citizens and human beings. That's been forgotten. And it will be forgotten and will remain forgotten as long as the fear narrative continues to be peddled and we don't stop and we don't pause and we don't look back. And not only will those people be forgotten, but all of the missed cancer screens, all of the health consequences during lockdown, they will all be forgotten or brushed to one side as long as we keep up the fear narrative. So it's not about my opinion or Jerry's opinion or Graham's opinion. It's not about opinion. It's about keeping going so that these facts aren't looked back on and discussed, but they're not opinions.
So, king of facts, Ivor, you know, your stats and your videos have, in plain, you know, as obvious as you possibly can be, shown the facts to people. One of the things I often hear is people say, but lockdowns have saved lives. And without them, we would have had a much worse outcome, you know, for the total death count. But you've looked at the evidence. You've looked at the papers that have been written. What have you seen on that front?
Right, well, don't know about king of facts, but my catchphrase over 30 years of complex problem solving was show me the data. And data, it means facts. So we're in a post-fact era. So from way back, it became clear from the Diamond Princess, just in terms of the severity of the disease, I might just pick up on that first. I knew back in March from Diamond Princess, we had 3,700 people, around 2,200 crew, not of advanced age. We had a certain number of deaths and people in their late 70s and late 80s. And that was a Petri ship. We had a hyper-focused transmission there and no one was taking any kind of precautions, and there was ventilation systems, etc. So I knew the ceiling, it would be an average age, life expectancy would be the deaths, and it'd be 1,000 times worse for aged frail. So the severity of this, if we look at Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford, he got in trouble for this, but the WHO mounted his last paper in October 2020, and the infection fatality rate, and this would be a ceiling, is 0.15%. Right? But that's a ceiling after many seasons when everyone has been sozzled. The reality is Sweden, in terms of both lockdowns and severity, answers the question. And many people may be unaware, given our media propaganda. Sweden did a sterling job. They played an absolute blinder and they stuck to Western 50 years of pandemic management science, where all the other countries, like the WHO instructed, said, drop all our science and copy China. And that's on the record in February 2020. They said, drop everything and copy China. So Sweden went ahead. What happened in the end? Well, Professor Levitt, Michael Levitt, Nobel Prize winner, Stanford, has done all the figures with the Stanford team. We now have them. And in terms of excess death over what would have happened anyway, Sweden is around 300 per million inhabitants. 0.03%. So Professor Ioannidis was saying, well, a 0.15% ceiling, but in actual excess mortality after 2 full seasons, the whole thing with no lockdowns and no masks, Sweden are around 0.03% excess. That single-handedly proves that the draconian lockdowns and mask mandates cannot have contributed anything of note because of Sweden. So that's essentially it. So this perception I hear all the time, well, Ireland would have had more. I mean, we know from the data from the CSO, etc., and RIP, that 2020 is roughly the same death levels as 18. And April 2020 is roughly the same spike as January 2018, the flu spike. We know that. Then people say, oh, but if we had have let it rip. But the reality is Sweden and all the other regions answer that question. And like you say, Marcus, these are not opinions. You can say any group of data that you try and articulate what it means to people, you could say an element of opinion creeps in. But what I'm saying here isn't opinion, because I'm saying the data and I'm just saying what it says. And to anyone with a brain, they should see that. But we're in a post-facts era. We're in a post-rational thought era almost. I can't believe what I'm watching the last year. Even technical people I know have fallen into this cognitive dissonance. But I'm happy to say my top technical people in my medical and research network around the world, and my top people in my engineering world of problem solving, all across my top strata of the best, they all get it. Yeah. And we are absolutely aligned. But they can't say anything because they're working in corporations and institutions where they cannot speak, because then their salary is threatened, their mortgage and their children are threatened.
And if you just take a step back and think about that, just the sheer insanity that if you speak the truth and you show facts, that your livelihood is threatened. So I just want to touch, well, not touch, but start looking at the vaccination rollout. And one of the countries that you mentioned yesterday when we had a quick chat was Gibraltar. And this whole idea then of a vaccine passport being, what's really the purpose? Because what we are seeing is it doesn't have, the transmission is actually the big issue here, and it's not stopping transmission.
Yeah, well, I'll speak briefly on that. I always preface what I say. I have no strong opinion on vaccines in general up until now. I don't care about vaccines that are fully approved, established. This is under emergency use authorisation, so it should be for the susceptible and the at-risk, and it should always be voluntary too, in my opinion. But under 50 years of age, we have the data. Marcus referred to under 25. The risk for those people is around 1 in a million, arguably lower under 25s in Ireland if they are truly healthy or don't have a condition. Under 50s, as an overall group, the risk from the actual real world data of the last year and a half, multiple seasons, high PCR positivity, it's gone everywhere. What was the risk under 50 in Ireland? Around 1 in 50,000. Right? 1 in 50,000. So the risks are tiny under 50, never mind children where it's effectively zero. And the key thing is that when the pharmaceutical companies brought out these emergency use vaccines, they acknowledged up front quietly that it may not affect transmission. Right? The reality is in the real world data, where I've been watching it for months, if you look at countries with high rates versus low, the curves are all the same. Right, for cases, and we won't get into mortality. If you look at Israel's data, they stopped publishing it a few days ago, but it showed for all age brackets, the case rates were the same for vaccinated and unvaccinated, and they even categorized by all age brackets. It was the same for both. Gibraltar is the highest vaccinated country, I think, in the world, almost 100%. And in the last few weeks, they've become the third highest, I believe, in the world in case rates, and they have shot up. Now, I'm not saying the vaccine is driving cases, but the reality is when you do an intervention en masse, like has been done, the scientist watches for the signal, and you will see the signal. And what we're seeing, if anything, is not only no signal for improved transmission, but the CDC in Massachusetts now, they've acknowledged transmission doesn't seem to be affected. We have isolated people out in mining companies, I think it was Borneo, where you see no effect on transmission. And we see all of what I just said. So you're looking for some signal, anything, to suggest that the vaccine may reduce transmission. But we actually see a mild signal of the opposite. Now, there's almost no question but any benefit on transmission from this particularly emergency released medication, any effect on transmission, if it's there, it's small at best. So there is zero scientific logic for a passport. There is zero logic for forced vaccination of young people. They have no risk and you're not getting a transmission benefit. So that's it. I can't see any way out of that.
On that note, one of the COVID webinars, Ronan Glynn said specifically, and it's on tape, that we don't know whether the vaccine works. We don't know what side effects it has. We don't know whether it stops you passing the virus. We don't know how long it lasts. But we do know that 63% of people in Ireland say that they implicitly trust their GPs. And we want you to get behind it. That was his justification. He had no information, so you cannot give informed consent.
Yeah, and just one last reply on that. Informed consent is crucial. And one thing I neglected to mention was these young people under 25 with a 1 in a million or arguably less risk, The risk from the vaccine is documented. I mean, the Johnson & Johnson label says up to 1 in 10,000 risk of serious clots in spleen, liver, etc. This is not controversial, and the databases that record side effects, it's 1 in tens of thousands, which is pretty small, of significant effects. So if you personally have a risk less than 1 in a million, you know, you're taking on a risk-reward ratio that's wrong for you for a medication, which is emergency use. So the only argument, yet again, would be transmission. You're helping granny. And we know from the real-world data, all over the world, that that's not the case. So you'd have to ask, what's driving this relentless obsession with driving an emergency use medication into the whole population? I'm not sure.
And most people are completely unaware that it is emergency use only, that it is not actually a fully licensed drug. So, okay, what's going to happen if things don't change? What are we looking at as we go forward?
Well, I fear that the vaccines will cause a major problem. And I fear that, in fact, the whole COVID hoax that I refer to it as was brought about for the purposes of bringing in the vaccine. I fear, and I hope I'm wrong, I truly hope I'm wrong, that it'll lead to infertility, because we know the spike proteins accumulate in the testicles and in the ovaries of young people, or people generally. I also fear that the vaccine could in effect cause cancer down the road. There are a number of cancers that are caused by inserting viral RNA into the genome of people, such as Burkitt's lymphoma, such as a number of lymphomas, such as cervical cancer. The cervical cancer in women is caused by the presence of a virus in the cells and the RNA being transferred into the DNA of the people, and I fear that we will end up with a massive pandemic of cancers in 3 to 5 years' time. That's what I fear.
And Graham, where do you see this going from the kind of even financial point of view? What are you seeing coming down the road?
Well, I can't do predictions. It's too difficult. But I am worried that we will end up in a society that doesn't resemble what we're used to. I did live for a year of my life in China, which was fascinating, and I feel like the Irish and European experience draws from China in ways that make no sense. Talking about masks, for example, that's not something that you see in China except in very polluted, massive cities. You don't see. You know, I lived in a smaller city. Its population was still larger than the population of Ireland, but as a small Chinese city, it was not a place where masks were commonplace. And so I find that people hear things about China and they don't understand them, and then what we will end up with is something that's worse than China in terms of the level of control. And I think that's quite terrifying. I also think that as has been said, the justifications make no sense. In terms of the restrictions on indoor dining, for example, Micheál Martin said it was in order to protect the unvaccinated, as if that's a risk. Not having a vaccination and dining indoors is too risky. It's a risk that somebody should not be allowed to take. That, on the other hand, being obese is still legal. Doing all sorts of other terrible lifestyle choices is legal, and yet not taking a vaccine for something that statistically may pose you no risk is illegal if you want to live a normal life. So, as Ivor said, we are in post-facts, and it's worrying. But I think the truth will persist. They can't delete our tweets. They can't delete.
They can try their best to suppress it, but it keeps popping up.
So, but they can only run for it for so long. So, yeah. I think we'll get there in the end.
And Tracey, from a legal point of view, this whole division now in society. Again, if things don't change, if the Irish people just continue to accept this, where are we heading?
I think it goes back to a certain degree to something that Ivor said, you know, about the people that I suppose that he has most trusted in certain levels, whether it was engineering or medical or science over the last number of years, that all of those people actually agree with his opinions and the opinions he has expressed over the last year and a half, but they won't say anything. And they won't say anything, and I think Gerry has said it too, you know, because they can't do what Gerry did. You know, they can't give up their livelihoods, or like Marcus said, you know, they can't go through the investigation process. I'm currently being investigated for misconduct because of everything that I've done over the last year and a half. In my family, my boyfriend, Mike, who's in the army for 21 years, we've never publicly said he was in the army until the last maybe couple of weeks. He's retiring from the army now inside the next 20 days so that he can publicly express his views, because obviously when you go into the army you give up certain of even your constitutional rights around free speech and that, because they're required to remain apolitical. So people can either make the decision to make the sacrifice now, or they can make the decision that their children will sacrifice. So that's the way that I see it. I have no, I'm very sorry to say it, but I have no sympathy for the people who say at this point, I can't speak out. If you don't speak out now, your children are going to be the people who suffer. Because like Graham said, the future that we are, you know, creating for children and grandchildren, it will resemble nothing like we have ever seen before. The levels of coercion and control that they're going to experience and they're going to live under, that's down to the parents. That's down to the parents not being willing to speak out. But in terms of what I think is going to happen over the next number of months, I would presume, and this is opinion obviously, I would presume that we're going to be into another lockdown maybe by October. A lot of people I think are talking about a lockdown maybe before that. But what I'm wondering is, will the lockdown be for everybody? So will they shut everybody down again? Will they close down hospitality again? Or will it just be for the unvaccinated people? So we know that over the next number of months they're going to want booster shots for people. I don't see how they encourage the vaccinated people to get the booster shots if they're being treated the same way as the unvaccinated people. So my fear is that come October there may be more restrictions for the unvaccinated people. But you have to hold the line. You have to hold the line. If you don't believe something is right, you have to stick by that regardless of the consequences, because you have to stop thinking about today and think about tomorrow. So that's my view.
Marcus, where do you see this going?
Well, I don't know. I think we talked about this before we went on air about, you know, what are the terrible things down the line for us. It's hard to look at the terrible things down the line when you see the terrible things unfolding before us, you know. I wonder at times, you know, what were the Egyptians doing, or what were the Romans doing at the time? What were they distracted by before their civilization collapsed? You know, I think that what's happening is a colossal distraction from very, very, very real things, very real suffering. The drug addicts on the street who are not talked about anymore, you know, homeless people, poor people, immigrants, immigration. You know, every year in sub-Saharan Africa, there's, 12 million kids die from diarrhea, curable, treatable diseases with a packet of Diorolite and a litre of water. We're distracted from all of that reality with this idiocy that's taken over, an idiocy that's driven by fear, that's driven by an unsubstantiated fear. I fear that people won't rein in their fear and start to see what's really going on. And history, but I'm reassured in the sense because history has had several eras of apartheids. There was an apartheid in South Africa where an awful lot of people believed that a black person shouldn't urinate in the same toilet as you, or else he'd next be breaking into your home or sleeping with your wife or something. History has given us several periods where fundamentally irrational, non-fact, non-science-based beliefs were the currency of the day. We're in one of those now, and my fear is that it may take us a long time to come out of it. But I suppose my biggest fear is not so much about the future, it's about the here and the now, about the people that are being forgotten about because of this idiocy, I have to say.
And Ivor, your opinion going forward?
My opinion. Idiocy, it's a fair word, and we get kind of criticised for calling people, derogatory names for falling for this. And in fairness, the 24-hour round-the-clock propaganda and all the bad actors driving it, you have to forgive to a point the people. But yeah, coming into the winter, God only knows, it's quite clear they've come after our kids. The thing that really drove me and motivated me, and people are surprised I'm still unscathed by all the abuse and everything, and to be honest, it's irrelevant to me. I have 5 children. Myself, my wife have always been focused on the future of the children. We'll all get old and die. We just don't really care about that. It's all about the kids. And then truth and science and facts. I've lived my whole life for it. It's my calling card. So those 2 things will drive me inexorably. But what's coming? They're coming for the kids based on zero rationality, zero science. It's clear they want the mass vaccination. And I think there's a couple of things, not getting into conspiracy theory here, but Occam's razor and logic, given the facts. They want nearly 100%, and I think one of the reasons is to enable the ID card. And I think the ID card is a massive goal, even beyond the vaccine. We know that Blair, the war criminal, 10, 15 years ago tried to get it in. We know a lot about the world financial system and massive challenges coming where they'll probably have to go to e-currencies, and you need an ID system as the infrastructure for that. So I think there's a lot of things and a lot of parties driving this. Come the winter, the virus tends to resurge. I don't go for so much that the vaccine will cause mass problems. I think it'll cause minority problems, and they will be severe here and there. But I think when the winter comes, it may even exacerbate, in a sense, the viral triggering this winter. It may make things a little worse than they would have been, ironically, or maybe not. But either way, they are going to, like last winter, jump on the opportunity of remorselessly driving home their agenda, even though it is not based in logic. So we're going to see rough stuff this winter. And boiling frog, I agree with Tracey. If you don't stand up when the temperature's going up, you won't have a choice when it's boiling. It's been seen all through history. Yeah. It's too late when the control systems are fully in place and everything's tracked, traced, locked down, and our whole world is different for our children and grandchildren. You can't speak up then. It'll be even worse than now. So I would say speak up now while you can.
Yeah, so on that note, one piece of advice you would give to people, what can they do right now?
Don't get the vaccine.
That's your advice.
Don't get the vaccine. If, as Ivor said, it was related to just getting in the passport, then they could have easily used innocuous vaccine. They could easily have used something that doesn't have the possible implications of implanting viral RNA into your DNA. That is wrong, fundamentally wrong. I've been involved in vaccination for 40 years. I've given thousands of vaccines. I've taken vaccines. I've never had a worry about them. What worries me about is the actual inserting this RNA messenger into the human genome. That worries me really, really, really severely. I have a great fear of that.
Graham, what can people do? What would be your key piece of advice?
Yeah, well, just keeping things very simple. The government clearly feeds off division and polarization in society. It's a divide and rule tactic. They want people fighting with each other so we don't look upwards and see what they're doing. So I think we need to treat our fellow human beings with as much respect and empathy as possible, regardless of their attitude to this disease. We need to respect the fact that there has been a propaganda campaign like never witnessed in our lifetimes before, and that has put people in a position of fear. So I'm not saying that any of this is easy, of course, but allow people to be afraid, and if you can help them to get out of the fear, do so. But it's really a psychological operation that we've experienced more than anything else. So just try and treat the people who are afraid with as much respect as possible, and hopefully we can, over time, bring them to a place where they're less afraid. And let's not fight each other. It's the government is the problem.
Absolutely. Thanks, Graham. Tracey.
So for me at the minute, it's all around the kids and the vaccine. So the Non-Fatal Offences Against the Person Act states that persons over the age of 16 can consent to their own dental, medical or surgical treatment without the consent of a parent or a legal guardian. So for children over the age of 16, make sure they're educated on the benefits versus the risks of the vaccination. Make sure that they understand that they may be approached in the school or through their GP to get the vaccination. Make sure they know what your wishes are as a parent and what your views are as a parent. And make sure they know that vaccines are not mandatory. They can say no, they can say I want to call my parent or my legal guardian. Then with respect to children under the age of 16, what I would say to parents is write to your GPs and write to your children's school. Tell them, number one, you do not consent to your child getting the vaccine if it is the case that you don't consent. Number two, you don't consider your child to be a mature minor, which is children under the age of 16 in some other jurisdictions like New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Northern Ireland. So children under the age of 16, if they're considered mature enough, intelligent-wise and in understanding, to be able to understand the medical treatment that is being proposed to them by a healthcare provider, they can actually give consent without a parent or a legal guardian knowing about it. So tell the school, number one, you don't consent to the vaccine on behalf of your child. Number two, you do not consider your child to be a mature minor. And in circumstances where the school or the GP administer the vaccine, you'll hold them personally liable for any damage caused and also for the interference with your constitutional right to safeguard the welfare of your child. And then the final thing I think to note as well is just in relation to consent from parents. Generally speaking, in other jurisdictions, one parent consent is considered sufficient. So if one parent consents and the other parent doesn't consent, in law, the healthcare provider that actually gives that vaccine would not be held liable in battery and criminal law. So you want to be very, very careful if one of the parents consents to the vaccine and the other parent doesn't consent. So I would also state in that letter that you do not consider one parent consent to be sufficient. So that's what I would say, write to the schools, write to the GP, make sure they know what your views are and what the consequences of them administering the vaccine without your consent is.
Great advice. Marcus, what's your advice?
My advice, I concur with every single word that Tracey has said and what Jerry has said and Ivor and Graham, but certainly in respect of the vaccines, in my own opinion, I firmly believe that children should not be vaccinated, and this is a time for parents to stand up. And if they wouldn't stand up for themselves and they wouldn't stand up for what went on in terms of nursing homes or masks or whatever, a line is being crossed now when it comes to children, but and they do need to stand up and take heed of what's been said here. But frequently I'm asked as a GP by patients, what can I do? What can I do? And I find myself saying the piece of advice that I give to people is I think, the way to defeat this narrative really is not with counterfactuals, as we've talked. They don't seem to work, although we have a duty to keep pushing them. But the way to defeat this is, I think, to let people see that you are a healthier, happier, stronger person yourself, despite the fact that you don't buy in to the narrative. So stay strong, stay internal, and realize that simplicity and happiness are almost synonyms. So asking ourselves what we need, well, not just about vaccines, but what we need in terms of financially, what we need in terms of materially, what we need in terms of what counts as emotional support. We don't get emotional support from likes on Twitter. We get emotional support from our loved ones and from our family. So my advice is be happier, be a happier person. And that's the way to fight the narrative or the fact that reality is so difficult to promote.
Yeah, lovely. And Ivor?
Yep. No, I'd sound off that with stoicism, and I've been saying it a long period of time. You need to be stoical about this. You need to push back to the best of your ability within the things that are threatened against you. You need to push back, but you always need to keep hope for the future. So the reality is, and last summer when I saw mandatory masks come in absolute conflict with the science, etc., I knew we were heading for very dangerous territory because it was the middle of summer, Northern Europe, the virus was de-triggered, ICU's empty, a mandatory mask came in and people bought it. So I knew this is going to get rough. But I put myself forward a year to where we might end up where we are now, and we actually have ended up where we are now. I just say people have to try and find the courage to speak up, try and, look at the facts and get over their cognitive dissonance and get past the propaganda, switch off RTE and the Irish Slimes and all that, because that's just a torrent of nonsense. And then try and speak up. If you're not going to go out and get a megaphone and get in trouble with your work, just speak at the water cooler, speak about facts, And there are things we can do, like the 180,000 households got a 2-pager leaflet with some of the basic facts here. We didn't even get into vaccines because that's too hot to handle for many people. Just the facts. Get it out there, print it, discuss it. Talk to your guard if you get stopped at a checkpoint. Chat to them, ask them what they think. Ask your pharmacist about the vaccine. Imagine 20, 30,000 people went in and asked the pharmacist very specific questions about the emergency use, or is it fully approved? Yeah, but imagine you did.
Just to ask questions, yeah.
Ask the questions and then show them the printouts.
Not be afraid to ask questions.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
This is one of the things.
It drives me crazy.
Yeah.
People are afraid to talk.
So just have some courage. Well, I don't think any of us would be here if we didn't already have that courage within us, but hopefully we've, as a group and the others who've taken part in these sort of discussions, can help others to build that courage and to find that courage inside themselves. And the human spirit is incredible, and I think they maybe underestimated that side of us all. So I'd like to thank you all for being part of this Iconoclast Roundtable, and wish you all the very best of luck going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
You do.